Lord Peter Wimsey, whose capacity for taking the wrong trifles seriously had saved more than one person from the gallows, first encountered the Axeman of New Orleans on a particularly dreary Tuesday morning in the reading room of the Athenaeum Club. The encounter was of the literary variety, a brief, sensationalized account buried between the obituaries and a tedious editorial on tariff reform in the Pall Mall Gazette. The fog outside pressed against the tall windows like an uninvited guest, and the usual collection of elderly gentlemen rustled their newspapers with the sort of dignified irritation reserved for those who find the modern world insufficiently respectful of their morning constitutional. The Axeman himself, being safely deceased and several thousand miles distant, had obligingly resurrected himself in a column quaintly headed Echoes of America, Strange Tales from Across the Atlantic. According to the Gazette's breathless prose, he had been a legend from New Orleans, storied past a phantom with a hatchet and an inexplicable fondness for syncopated music, who had once terrorized the Crescent City with a curious ultimatum. Households that played jazz would be spared his nocturnal visits, while those that clung to more conventional musical tastes might expect a rather more permanent form of criticism. Jazz as prophylactic against murder, observed Wimsey to his valet, Bunter, who was attending to the morning's correspondence with his usual methodical precision. How refreshingly American in its pragmatism. One wonders what the Royal College of Physicians might make of such a therapeutic recommendation. Indeed, my lord, replied Bunter, his tone carrying just the faintest suggestion of disapproval for colonial eccentricities, though I note the Gazette has attributed the Axeman's rather florid proclamation to Cicero. The classical education of modern journalists appears somewhat deficient. Wimsey extended one long aristocratic finger to prod the offending newsprint. Cicero indeed, apud quem resest, est et experimentum, though I suspect our American phantom was more likely quoting Street. Augustine, if he was quoting anyone at all beyond his own fevered imagination. Still, one must admire the theatrical flair. A killer with literary pretensions is always more interesting than the merely sordid variety. At precisely that moment, as if summoned by this casual invocation of murder most artistic, a letter arrived bearing the familiar, precise handwriting of the Reverend Mr. Pargeter of Street Crucis on Sea. The envelope carried the faint, ecclesiastical aroma of incense and sealing wax, and Pargeter's correspondence, Wimsey knew from long experience, arrived only when matters had progressed well beyond the merely peculiar into the realm of the genuinely alarming. The letter itself was a masterpiece of clerical indignation, abbreviated by urgency and underlined by what appeared to be genuine terror. My dear Peter, it began without preamble. I have no patience with imported demons. We have always manufactured our own, and considerably better ones. However, this is no jest. There has been a most offensive placard nailed to our church door, some vulgar American nonsense, invoking this Axeman of New Orleans and threatening death to any household that does not have jazz in their clown. Hearts. The entire parish has taken leave of its senses. Mrs. Weatherby has purchased a gramophone. The Hendersons are attempting something they call the Charleston in their front parlor, and I discovered the curate practicing what he assured me was a hot lick on the church organ. The letter continued with increasing agitation. But this morning, Peter, the matter has taken a decidedly sinister turn. Sir Julius Rotherham has been found dead in his music room at Trenwith House, killed, if you can credit such barbarity, with a wood axe. The servants whisper of American murderers stalking our peaceful village. The constabulary mutters about jazz and madmen. I am ashamed to burden you with such apparent nonsense, but as you once convinced a jury about the significance of a hatbox, perhaps you will condescend to visit Street Crucis before the entire parish abandons civilization in favor of syncopation. Wimsey set down the letter with the sort of careful precision usually reserved for handling unexploded ordnance. Bunter, he said, his voice carrying a note of genuine interest for the first time that morning, it appears our American phantom has crossed the Atlantic. How very enterprising of him. One might almost suspect a certain colonial ambition in the matter. Shall I prepare the photographic apparatus, my lord? Inquired Bunter, who had already begun the subtle preparations that preceded any of his master's investigative expeditions. "Certainly, and do include the portable gramophone. I refuse to allow any self-respecting ghost, American or otherwise, to maintain a monopoly on musical appreciation. We shall take the next train to Street Crucis and discover whether our axeman has developed a taste for English blood, or whether some more terrestrial agency is employing his reputation for purposes of their own." Street Crucis on Sea, when they reached it in the fading light of a grey September afternoon, presented itself as a village so quintessentially English that it might have been assembled by a committee of nostalgic expatriates. The small harbour sheltered a modest fleet of fishing boats that bobbed with the resigned patience of creatures long accustomed to the vagaries of tide and weather. The ancient church, which had spent several centuries in a dignified battle with coastal erosion, perched on its cliff-top with the stubborn determination of an institution that had weathered both Norman invasion and Methodist revival. The Reverend Mr. Pargeter met them at the vicarage gate, a spare, scholarly man whose usual expression of mild ecclesiastical authority had been replaced by something approaching genuine alarm. In his hand, held with the sort of distaste usually reserved for particularly heretical theological treatises, was the offensive placard itself. "You see the quality of our imported devil," he said by way of greeting, extending the document for Whimsy's inspection. Nailed to the church door at some ungodly hour, with all the theatrical flourish of a medieval indulgence seller, the placard, executed in bold black letters on cheap paper, bore a message that managed to combine menace with a curious sort of democratic appeal. Whimsy examined the document with the sort of scholarly attention he might have devoted to a disputed manuscript. "Admirably theatrical," he pronounced finally, "though I detect a certain lack of authentic American vernacular. Our correspondent has modeled his style rather too closely on biblical prophecy and penny dreadfuls. The spelling is disappointingly conventional. It suggests education rather than inspiration. The village has responded with unseemly enthusiasm," Pargeter replied grimly. "Half the parish is attempting to master the foxtrot as a form of spiritual insurance. The other half has locked their doors and hidden their musical instruments. And Sir Julius Rotherham, God rest his soul, lies dead in his music room with his head split open like a melon." Sir Julius was not, I take it, a devotee of modern American musical forms? Whimsy inquired. He considered anything composed after Mozart to be evidence of cultural decline, Pargeter said. His niece, Miss Lydia Rotherham, had recently acquired a gramophone against his express wishes. They quarrelled about it most bitterly. She is a willful child, much given to reading unwholesome literature and entertaining modern notions about feminine independence. And the murder itself? Discovered this morning by the housekeeper, Mrs. Bletchley. The music room was locked from the inside, the key in Sir Julius's pocket. The window stood slightly open enough to admit our phantom, according to the local constabulary. There was a gramophone playing when she found him, though the record had wound down to a whisper. Most curious of all, the record was Beethoven, hardly the jazz our axeman demands. Whimsy's eyebrows rose fractionally. Things was like a locked room, a gramophone playing classical music, and a victim who opposed jazz murdered by someone demanding musical modernization. The contradictions are almost artistic in their complexity. I think, my dear Pargeter, that we are dealing with a mind of considerable subtlety, and one that may have rather more terrestrial motivations than supernatural ones. Trenwith House stood beyond the village proper, a solid Georgian manor that had been improved by successive generations of Rotherhams until it achieved that particular English combination of architectural dignity and domestic comfort that speaks of old money carefully preserved. The fog that had followed them from London clung to its grey stone walls and mullioned windows, lending the building an air of melancholy that seemed almost too appropriate for a house of recent murder. Inspector Preece of the Blackstone on Avon Constabulary met them in the entrance hall, a man who possessed the sort of stolid competence that made him invaluable for dealing with poachers and market-day disturbances, but who seemed somewhat out of his depth when confronted with supernatural American murderers. His greeting to Whimsy carried the cautious respect of a professional who had heard tales of aristocratic interference but remained hopeful that common sense might yet prevail. "I've heard of your lordship's interests," he said diplomatically, "though I must say this business seems clear enough. Someone took advantage of all this Axeman nonsense to settle a score with Sir Julius. Probably someone local with a grudge will have them soon enough." The music room itself told a more complex story than Inspector Priest's confident assessment suggested. It was a chamber that reflected Sir Julius's particular combination of wealth and conservative taste. Mahogany paneling, leather-bound volumes of musical criticism, and a magnificent broadwood piano that dominated one corner like a polished monument to traditional values. The air still carried the faint, acrid scent of paraffin oil and something else, something metallic and unpleasant that spoke of violence in a room designed for harmony. Sir Julius sat in his favorite armchair, a high-backed leather throne positioned to command the best view of both piano and fireplace. Death had not improved his naturally irascible expression, and the wood axe that lay beside his chair seemed almost redundant, an afterthought to a crime that had already achieved its essential purpose. The gramophone stood open on a side table, its brass fittings gleaming in the grey afternoon light that filtered through the slightly opened casement window. Whimsy approached the scene with the delicate precision of a connoisseur examining a particularly complex vintage. He noted the position of the body, the angle of the fallen axe, the small scatter of sheet music that had been disturbed by some recent commotion. But it was the gramophone that drew his closest attention specifically, the record that still rested on its turntable. "Beethoven's Minuet in G," he observed, lifting the disc with careful fingers. "Hardly the sort of syncopated rhythm our American phantom demands. Either our Axeman has developed unexpectedly classical tastes, or someone wished to send a rather different message than the one proclaimed on church doors." Bunter, who had been conducting his own methodical examination of the room's periphery, cleared his throat diplomatically. "My lord, if I might direct your attention to the window-sill. There appears to be a mark, the impression of a heel, I believe, and of a rather delicate construction." Whimsy moved to examine the indicated spot, his monocle catching the light as he bent to study the faint but distinct impression left in the paint of the window frame. "A lady's shoe, I should say, and recently made the paint dust, has not yet settled. Inspector, does this suggest to you the heavy boots of a supernatural American murderer, or might we be dealing with someone rather closer to home?" Inspector Priest examined the mark with the sort of professional skepticism that suggested his faith in phantom killers had already begun to waver. "Could be anyone, my lord. The window was open, anyone might have climbed through." "Indeed," Whimsy replied, his tone carrying just the faintest suggestion of irony. "Though I confess myself curious about the precise timing of events. When, exactly, was Sir Julius discovered, and by whom? The details, Inspector, are always illuminating, particularly in cases involving locked rooms and mysterious musical preferences." As if summoned by this request for information, the sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of the household staff, led by a formidable woman in black, who could only be the redoubtable Mrs. Bletchley. Behind her trailed a younger woman, whose fashionable dress and defiant expression marked her immediately as Miss Lydia Rotherham, the niece, whose gramophone had caused such familial discord. "Inspector, Mrs. Bletchley announced with the sort of authority that suggested she had been managing crises in the Rotherham household for considerably longer than anyone cared to remember. "I've brought Miss Lydia as you requested, though I must say the poor child has suffered quite enough shock for one day." Miss Lydia Rotherham stepped forward with the sort of determined composure that suggested she had no intention of allowing anyone, police, relatives, or supernatural murderers, to treat her as a helpless female. She was perhaps 25, with the sort of intelligent, determined features that marked her as a thoroughly modern young woman, and her eyes held a mixture of grief and something else, something that might have been fear or guilt, or simply the complex emotions of someone whose family relationships had been permanently severed by violence. "Lord Peter Whimsy, I presume," she said, extending a gloved hand with the sort of directness that would have scandalized an earlier generation. "I've read about your methods in the newspapers. I do hope you'll be more successful than the local constabulary in discovering who really killed my uncle and why someone would wish to make it appear the work of some ridiculous American phantom. Whimsy accepted her handshake with the sort of grave courtesy that acknowledged both her grief and her obvious intelligence. Miss Rotherham, I shall certainly do my best to discover the truth of the matter, though I must warn you that the truth, when it emerges, may prove rather more complex than any of us currently imagine. Tell me, if you would, about this gramophone that caused such discord between you and your uncle. Was it merely a matter of musical taste, or were there deeper issues at stake? The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications that none of them were quite ready to examine. Outside, the fog continued its patient siege of Trenwith House, and somewhere in the distance, the sea whispered against the shingle with the sort of rhythmic persistence that might, to a sufficiently imaginative listener, have resembled the syncopated beat of jazz music drifting across the Atlantic from a continent where phantoms carried axes and demanded tribute in the form of modern melodies. The investigation, Lord Peter Wimsey reflected, as he prepared to begin his methodical dissection of alibis and motivations, promised to be considerably more interesting than a simple case of supernatural visitation. The Axeman of New Orleans might have provided the inspiration, but the murder of Sir Julius Rotherham bore all the hallmarks of a thoroughly English crime, one rooted in family, tensions, social expectations, and the sort of personal grievances that festered behind the facade of respectable country life. The game, as another detective of his acquaintance might have observed, was decidedly afoot. The interrogation of Trenwith House's domestic arrangements commenced with Mrs. Bletchley in the morning room, where she presided with the sort of grim authority that suggested 30 years of managing both household crises and aristocratic eccentricities. Her black bombazine rustled with military precision as she positioned herself to command both the conversation and her view of the servants' entrance, a woman clearly accustomed to maintaining order through vigilant observation. Sir Julius was discovered at precisely 8 o'clock this morning. She began without preamble, her voice carrying the neutral authority of someone who had long ago ceased to be impressed by either murder or investigation. I went to rouse him for breakfast, as was my custom. He was a creature of habit, Sir Julius, and would tolerate no deviation from his routine. When I received no answer to my knocking, I knew something was amiss. Wimsey, who had positioned himself near the window where the grey light would illuminate any subtle changes in expression, made a small correction with the air of a man who could not resist pedantic accuracy. The gramophone. Mrs. Bletchley, you mentioned hearing it. Wind down. The piece was identified as Beethoven's Minuet in G, though I feel compelled to observe that poor Petzold suffers the indignity of misattribution. A triviality, you might say, but I find murder often wedges itself into such trivialities as a door wedges on a mat. Sir Julius would have said the misattribution was typical of modern times. Mrs. Bletchley replied with the first hint of warmth in her voice. Sloppy and sentimental, he called such errors. But the master would never have played such a piece himself. He detested gramophones as inventions of the devil and permitted Miss Lydia's machine only after considerable argument. Inspector Preece, consulting his notebook, pressed for practical details. The music room door was locked from the inside, you said. What of the spare key? That's the peculiar thing, Inspector. The spare key for the music room was missing from its hook in my office. It's always kept behind the calendar, without exception. I had to use a different key from the general set. Her mouth tightened with disapproval. We are not a house of irregular comings and goings. Bunter, who had been conducting his own methodical examination of the room's periphery, cleared his throat diplomatically. Mrs. Bletchley, might I inquire about the household's use of paraffin? I detect traces on various surfaces, the curtain cord, the window catch. Mr. Digby uses it for the motor car maintenance, she replied, her eyes narrowing slightly. And there are the paraffin lamps for the outbuildings, though I cannot imagine why such substances would find their way into Sir Julius's music room. The examination of the physical evidence revealed details that spoke to a mind of considerable calculation. The window catch bore the faint impression of a narrow blade, something used to manipulate the latch from outside. More intriguing still was the smear of paraffin mixed with lamp black on the curtain cord and on the piano's polished surface, dust patterns suggesting that objects had been moved and replaced during the night. The metronome, Whimsy observed, indicating the brass instrument now positioned on the mantelpiece, shows evidence of recent relocation. Someone with access to this room spent considerable time rearranging its contents while the gramophone played. The staff interviews that followed painted a picture of a household balanced precariously between old traditions and modern tensions. Young Molly Perkins, the housemaid, provided nervous testimony about hearing faint music past 2 in the morning, not like a gramophone record, which would have stopped after a few minutes, but something that seemed to go on and on. More significant was the revelation of Mr. Grimsby, Sir Julius's secretary, whose convenient departure for London that very morning struck Whimsy as worthy of considerable attention. Mrs. Bletchley's description of this scholarly gentleman carried undertones of long-suppressed disapproval. Mr. Grimsby has been with Sir Julius for 5 years, ever since that unfortunate business with the archaeological expedition in the Mediterranean. Sir Julius invested considerable sums in the venture Roman remains, they claimed, though it came to nothing in the end. The master took pity on Mr. Grimsby, who had organized the expedition and found himself rather short of practical employment when it failed. His relationship with Sir Julius? Whimsy inquired. They had their differences. Mr. Grimsby holds modern ideas about social reform and political change, rather like Miss Lydia in that respect. He often argued with Sir Julius about the direction of English society. The master tolerated such discussions as intellectual exercise, but I sometimes wondered if Mr. Grimsby took them rather more seriously than intended. The interview with Miss Lydia Rotherham herself revealed a young woman determined to face the investigation with defiant composure. Her testimony confirmed the household's account of the previous evening's quarrel, but added details that suggested deeper currents of family tension. Quote, "Uncle Julius was a tyrant," she stated without remorse, "a benevolent one perhaps, but a tyrant nonetheless. My gramophone represented everything he despised about modern life: independence, artistic freedom, the refusal to live in his musical mausoleum. We had quite the row about it last night after dinner. He threatened to smash the machine. I threatened to play jazz during his afternoon nap. And after this quarrel?" Whimsy asked. "I retired to my sitting room and read until well past midnight. I put on a particularly spirited ragtime piece, I recall. My room faces the sea, and the walls here are quite thick. I heard nothing from the music room." Griggs, the footman, confirmed seeing lights in Miss Lydia's sitting room past 11 o'clock, though he insisted the soundproofing would have prevented him from hearing any music from that direction. As the afternoon wore on and the fog thickened around Trenwith House, Whimsy found himself constructing a mental portrait of a household where resentments had festered beneath the surface of civilized discourse. The missing secretary, the displaced objects, the curious choice of music, and the sophisticated method of entry all suggested a crime of considerable premeditation, one that employed the theatrical threat of the American Axeman as misdirection from more terrestrial motives. "Inspector," Whimsy observed as they concluded the initial interviews, "we appear to be dealing with someone who understands both the mechanical aspects of locked-room mysteries and the psychological value of supernatural misdirection. The question that remains is whether our phantom has crossed the Atlantic in pursuit of musical reform, or whether someone closer to home has found the Axeman's reputation a convenient mask for more personal grievances. The game, as he had noted earlier, was proving decidedly more complex than a simple case of imported American phantoms. The red herring arrived with the Morning Post and a considerable flourish of injured dignity, presenting himself to Inspector Preece with a sort of theatrical timing that suggested either remarkable coincidence or a flair for dramatic entrances. Mr. Edward Vale, Eddie, to the denizens of the Pier Pavilion, where he conducted what he optimistically termed the syncopators, possessed the kind of obvious guilt that made Inspector Preece's morning considerably brighter, and his faith in terrestrial solutions notably stronger. Vale swept into the drawing-room of Trenwith House, with hair brilliantined into submission and a tie of such injudicious width that it seemed to announce his profession before he opened his mouth. His manner combined injured innocence with stage bravado in proportions that would have made him invaluable to a touring melodrama company, though considerably less useful as a credible witness to his own character. "What you have against me, Inspector, is style rather than evidence," he declared, arranging himself in the offered chair as though rehearsing an exit scene. "And if style were a hanging matter, half this parish would be decorating the village green by tea-time." Inspector Preece, who had spent a restless night contemplating supernatural American murderers, greeted this tangible suspect with barely concealed relief. "The parish, Mr. Vale, prefers its music traditional and its nights peaceful. Perhaps you would enlighten us as to your whereabouts between midnight and 3 o'clock this morning?" Battling with machinery, Inspector, the eternal struggle of modern entertainment against Victorian engineering. Our generator drinks paraffin like a navvy and possesses the mechanical temperament of a prima donna. I spent the better part of the night coaxing it to maintain sufficient power for both lighting and gramophone. Whimsy, who had been examining a particularly fine example of Sheraton with the absorbed attention of a connoisseur, looked up with mild interest. "Ah, paraffin. We seem to encounter that particular substance with remarkable frequency in this investigation. Most illuminating, one might say." The evidence against Vale assembled itself with the sort of methodical precision that made Inspector Preece's professional heart sing with satisfaction. A typewriter at the Pavilion office bore the distinctive defect of drooping ease, the same mechanical flaw evident in the threatening letter found crammed in Sir Julius's blotter. The ribbon showed wear on the left margin, creating the uneven impression that marked the axeman's literary efforts. More damning still, Vale's cuffs bore fresh stains of paraffin, and a wood axe had vanished from the pavilion's supply of maintenance tools. "The letter threatens Sir Julius specifically," Preece explained, producing the document with the satisfaction of a conjurer revealing his final trick. "You and your dried-up clockwork will learn to love jazz, or the axeman will teach you." Found in the victim's own desk, written on paper that matches the pavilion's supply. Typed on a machine that bears your fingerprints, Mr. Vale. Vale's protestations carried the desperate energy of a man watching circumstantial evidence construct itself into a gallows around his neck. "Any fool can type, Inspector, and most fools do. That machine serves half the village, missus. Prynne uses it for invoicing, the door attendant for ticket counts, even the saxophonist for his interminable correspondence with admirers. We operate a democratic establishment where everyone shares the defective E." The village testimony provided its own damning chorus. Mrs. Prynne, whose husband managed the pavilion, swore she had observed Vale departing via the lane toward Street Crucis at 25 minutes past 1, carrying something wrapped in sacking. He had not returned until nearly 3 o'clock, ample time, as Inspector Preece noted with satisfaction, to commit murder and arrange the theatrical elements of the crime scene. Scene. "I went for paraffin," Vale insisted, his theatrical composure beginning to fray at the edges. "The generator failed during the Charleston competition, died on the encore, if you can credit such mechanical spite. I took a can and a spanner and addressed Providence in terms that would have scandalized the vicar." Bunter, who possessed an appreciative understanding of mechanical temperaments, observed diplomatically, "The belt shows considerable wear on the inner edge, my lord. It would ride crooked and produce a distinctive sound, a singing note at a particular pitch." "The pitch," Whimsy murmured thoughtfully, which young Molly Perkins described as music that seemed to continue indefinitely. Most curious behavior for a gramophone record, which typically concludes after a few minutes of performance. The financial motive emerged through careful questioning of the village's commercial relationships. Sir Julius had threatened to have the pavilion closed for offending public decency with its jazz performances, a closure that would have meant financial ruin for Vale and his musical enterprise. Miss Lydia's frequent attendance at the pavilion had particularly inflamed Sir Julius's disapproval, creating a triangle of romantic and financial interests that provided multiple avenues for murderous motivation. "Sir Julius called our music jungle noise," Vale admitted with bitter accuracy. He considered Miss Lydia's attendance a personal affront to family dignity. The old gentleman possessed definite opinions about the proper relationship between social class and musical appreciation. Yet, Whimsy found himself curiously unmoved by the apparent completeness of the case against Vale. The evidence assembled itself too neatly, like a stage set constructed for maximum dramatic effect, rather than the messy complexity that typically characterized actual crimes. The paraffin stains, the convenient typewriter defects, the missing axe, the threatening letter, each element served its purpose in the narrative of Vale's guilt with almost theatrical precision. "Inspector," he observed with characteristic mildness, "while Mr. Vale certainly possessed adequate motive for resenting Sir Julius's interference, I confess myself puzzled by certain aspects of the crime's execution. A man desperate enough to commit murder would surely choose a more straightforward approach than locked rooms and gramophone performances. The theatrical elements suggest someone with rather more sophisticated tastes in criminal methodology than our struggling musician might be expected to possess." Inspector Priest bristled slightly at this implied criticism of his investigative conclusions. "The evidence speaks for itself, my lord. Motive, opportunity, and physical proof. What more does justice require?" "Justice," Whimsy replied with a gentle smile that somehow managed to suggest vast reservoirs of unexpressed skepticism, "requires truth, Inspector. And truth, in my experience, rarely arranges itself quite so conveniently for the comfort of investigating officers. But by all means, keep a watchful eye on Mr. Vale. Only do not allow his obvious guilt to distract you from the possibility that someone else entirely may be conducting this particular orchestra." The observation hung in the morning air with the weight of quiet authority, suggesting that Lord Peter Whimsy had detected discordant notes in what appeared to be a perfectly harmonious solution to the mystery of Sir Julius Rotherham's death. Whimsy's amusement manifested itself in that peculiar manner, which those familiar with his investigative methods had learned to recognize as the prelude to revelations, both illuminating and profoundly uncomfortable for all concerned, while Inspector Priest remained contentedly absorbed in the gratifying simplicity of Mr. Reasoned. Vale's apparent guilt, Whimsy drifted through Trenwith House with the air of a connoisseur examining a particularly complex vintage, his attention alighting upon details that struck everyone else as utterly, maddeningly irrelevant to the matter of who had split Sir Julius Rotherham's skull with a wood axe. "The curtains, Mrs. Bletchley," Whimsy observed with the sort of scholarly attention typically reserved for disputed manuscripts, "present a fascinating study in domestic acoustics. Note their precise arrangement, not the casual positioning one might expect, but the methodical placement of someone intimately familiar with sound management principles." He ran his gloved fingers along the heavy velvet drapery, his monocle catching the grey afternoon light. "These particular curtains, when drawn in this exact configuration, create what acoustical engineers term a sound trap, absorbing musical vibrations rather than transmitting them to adjacent chambers." Mrs. Bletchley, whose meticulous nature extended to every fibre of the household furnishings, drew herself up with defensive pride. "The curtains are positioned as Sir Julius preferred, my lord. He was most particular about such arrangements. Indeed, he was. Yet someone has taken considerable liberty with his preferences." Whimsy moved to examine the curtain cord, lifting it between finger and thumb with the delicacy of a wine connoisseur testing a questionable vintage. Paraffin, with a distinct admixture of lamp black, admirable for reducing friction, though deplorable for maintaining the pristine condition of household furnishings. "Mrs. Bletchley, when did you last oil this particular cord?" "Oil it, my lord?" Her eyebrows marshaled themselves into formation. "We dust and polish daily, but oil would leave stains on the fabric. Precisely my point." Whimsy's attention shifted to the gramophone, which he wound with scientific precision, counting each turn with mathematical attention. At a prudent winding, one obtains approximately 4½ minutes of musical performance before the mechanism expires into sentimental whispers. Yet young Molly insists she heard continuous music well past 2 o'clock. Either the laws of mechanical physics have collapsed in deference to our American phantom, or Miss Molly was listening to quite a different virtuoso altogether. Bunter, who had been conducting his own methodical examination of the room's periphery, cleared his throat diplomatically. "My lord, if I might direct your attention to the electrical extension cord connected to the gramophone, the splicing shows evidence of recent modification alterations that would not have met with Sir Julius's approval. Excellent observation, Bunter. Someone has been rather more creative with household wiring than our victim would have tolerated. Whimsy traced the cord's path with growing interest, noting where it disappeared behind the heavy paneling. The modifications suggest a system designed to operate the gramophone remotely, a mechanical solution to the problem of providing continuous sound while establishing one's alibi elsewhere in the house. Inspector Preece, who had been following these technical observations with mounting frustration, attempted to reassert the primacy of tangible evidence. All very ingenious, my lord, but we have Mr. Vale's fingerprints on the typewriter, paraffin on his clothing, and witnesses to his movements. These mechanical theories don't alter the physical facts. On the contrary, Inspector, they illuminate the physical facts in an entirely new light. Whimsy had discovered something that made his eyes brighten with genuine satisfaction. A small control mechanism concealed behind the music stand, connected to the gramophone by nearly invisible wiring. Our killer didn't simply employ the Axeman's reputation as theatrical dressing. They created a sophisticated system that would provide the illusion of continuous musical performance while they established their presence elsewhere in the household. The implications of this discovery cast the previous evening's events in an entirely different perspective. Someone had spent considerable time and effort preparing for Sir Julius's murder, installing equipment that would create the acoustic evidence necessary to support their carefully constructed alibi. The endless music that Molly Perkins had described was not supernatural intervention, but mechanical ingenuity of a most sophisticated variety. The metronome, Whimsy continued, indicating the brass instrument now positioned on the mantelpiece, has been moved from its customary location beside the piano. Someone required its steady rhythm for purposes other than musical timing, perhaps to mask the sound of more clandestine activities. He set the device to a measured beat, noting how the sound seemed to crawl about the room, swelling and fading with the sea breeze that entered through the slightly opened casement. More revealing still was Whimsy's examination of the household clocks, each of which told a different story of temporal manipulation. The long case clock in the hall had been advanced by precisely 9 minutes, while the library's mantel clock lagged by 3. In the music room itself, a French ormolu timepiece had stopped at 2:10, its spring unwound despite Sir Julius's notorious precision regarding temporal accuracy. Someone has distributed temporal confusion throughout this house, like confetti at a wedding, Whimsy observed with obvious delight. The question is whether these discrepancies represent carelessness or calculation, and what advantage our killer gained by manipulating the household's perception of time. The missing key to the music room, Mrs. Bletchley confirmed, had last been seen on Tuesday morning during her weekly inventory information that suggested the murder had been planned with mathematical precision rather than committed in a moment of desperate improvisation. Someone with intimate knowledge of household routines had prepared for this crime, with the methodical attention of a clockmaker assembling a particularly complex mechanism. Inspector, Whimsy concluded, as the afternoon light began to fade through the fog-shrouded windows, we are dealing with a mind of considerable sophistication, one that understands not only the mechanical aspects of locked-room mysteries, but also the psychological value of misdirection. The Axeman of New Orleans may have provided inspiration, but this crime bears the hallmarks of someone who knows Trenwith House as intimately as they knew Sir Julius's personal habits. The revelation hung in the gathering dusk with the weight of quiet authority, suggesting that the solution to Sir Julius Rotherham's murder lay not in the obvious guilt of a desperate musician, but in the calculated planning of someone who had turned the very domesticity of English country life into an instrument of perfect crime. The chronology, when subjected to Whimsy's methodical dissection, proved to be as reliable as a stopped clock accurate twice a day, but thoroughly misleading in between. Armed with his pocket watch, a pedometer, and that peculiar combination of scholarly precision and aristocratic whimsy that characterized his investigative methods, he embarked upon what he cheerfully termed a temporal autopsy of the previous evening's events. Time, Inspector, is the most democratic of witnesses, Whimsy observed, consulting his breguet with the reverence of a priest handling sacred vessels. It cannot be bribed, cajoled, or persuaded to alter. It's testimony for the convenience of murderers or investigating officers. Yet someone has taken considerable liberties with its honest account. The first experiment required a brisk constitutional along the coastal path from the Pier Pavilion to Trenwith House. Bunter, equipped with stopwatch and notebook, followed in the Daimler while Whimsy set off on foot, maintaining the sort of purposeful stride that might be expected of a man carrying paraffin and homicidal intentions through the fog-shrouded lanes of Street Crucis. 22 minutes at a determined pace, Bunter reported upon Whimsy's arrival at the side gate. Add the burden of a heavy paraffin can and the implements of murder, and one approaches 30 minutes. The return journey, allowing for the same encumbrances, plus whatever nervous energy follows successful homicide, would consume another half-hour minimum. Whimsy nodded thoughtfully, removing his hat to examine a small tear acquired from an overhanging hawthorn, which places Mr. Vale's alleged round trip at precisely 1 hour. Bunter. Yet Mrs. Prynne observed his departure at 25 minutes past 1, and his return at nearly 3 o'clock, a window of some 95 minutes. Ample time for murder, one might think, yet curiously insufficient when one factors in the delicate mechanical operations required. The matter of Molly Perkins's endless music required more sophisticated investigation. Returning to the music room, Whimsy positioned himself in the servants' hall directly below, while Bunter operated the gramophone according to its discovered modifications. The results proved illuminating in ways that transcended mere musical appreciation. The Beethoven minuet played for its prescribed 4½ minutes before fading to mechanical whispers. Then, with a barely audible click, a different sound commenced, a low, rhythmic drone emanating from behind the paneling, punctuated by occasional mechanical thumps that suggested considerable engineering beneath the room's civilized veneer. "That, my dear Inspector, is what our Miss Perkins heard," Whimsy announced with obvious satisfaction. Not continuous gramophone music, but a carefully orchestrated mechanical performance designed to create the illusion of musical activity, while the actual perpetrator established their presence elsewhere in the household. The acoustic analysis revealed further sophistication. The music room's peculiar dimensions, enhanced by the strategic positioning of curtains and furniture, created resonance effects that would sustain and amplify brief musical phrases far beyond their natural duration. A single gramophone record, played at sufficient volume, would reverberate through the carefully tuned environment for several minutes after the mechanism fell silent. The household clocks presented their own fascinating narrative of deliberate deception. The long case clock in the hall had been advanced by 9 minutes, while the library timepiece lagged by 3. Most significantly, the French ormolu clock in the music room had stopped at precisely 2:10, a temporal anchor that appeared to establish the moment of murder while actually obscuring more inconvenient truths. "Someone has distributed chronological confusion throughout this house like wedding confetti," Whimsy observed, winding the stopped clock and watching it resume its honest mechanical duty. Mrs. Bletchley's evening rounds, which she insists concluded at 10:30, were actually completed nearly 20 minutes later, according to the kitchen clock she consulted. The manipulation creates gaps in the established timeline, gaps large enough to accommodate considerably more complex activities than anyone has yet admitted. The telephone exchange records provided their own contribution to the growing catalogue of impossibilities. Miss Trippett, the night operator, confirmed that the trunk call supposedly summoning Mr. Grimsby to London had been placed at 11:47, nearly an hour after the exchange ceased operation for the evening. Either the telephone company had developed supernatural capabilities, or someone had fabricated the entire emergency that provided Grimsby with such convenient justification for his morning departure. Mr. Grimsby's urgent summons, Whimsy explained with the sort of gentle irony reserved for particularly elegant deceptions, arrived via a communication system that had retired for the evening. One might almost suspect divine intervention were it not for the distinctly terrestrial fingerprints on the telephone apparatus. More revealing still was Griggs, the footman's reluctant admission that he had observed Mr. Grimsby returning to the house via the back gate at 11:30, a full hour after the secretary had supposedly retired in preparation for his early departure. The scholarly gentleman, it appeared, had been conducting nocturnal business of a nature he had not seen fit to share with investigating authorities. The reconstruction of the evening's domestic activities revealed a pattern of manipulation that extended far beyond simple misdirection. Each member of the staff had been provided with tasks that would position them in distant portions of the house during the crucial hours. Molly Perkins had been sent to inventory linens in the attic, Griggs assigned to polish silver in the pantry, and even Mrs. Bletchley's security rounds subtly altered to ensure her presence in the servants' quarters when murder was being committed in the music room. Someone possessed intimate knowledge of household routines, Whimsy concluded, and used that knowledge to orchestrate a symphony of alibis. Each witness was precisely positioned to provide testimony that would support the killer's carefully constructed narrative while remaining ignorant of the true sequence of events. Chronology. Lord Peter reflected with the satisfaction of a man who had discovered an opponent's weakness, represented the skeleton upon which all murder cases must hang their flesh of motive and circumstantial evidence. One might dress a corpse in any theatrical costume, American phantoms, supernatural visitations, or even ecclesiastical mysteries, but the bare bones of time possessed an inconvenient habit of asserting themselves when subjected to methodical examination. Accordingly, he proposed to Inspector Preece a perambulation that would have gratified the most rigorous of scientific minds. No dramatic confrontations or psychological revelations, merely distances, durations, and the inexorable tyranny of mechanical precision. Armed with his pocket watch, Bunter's stopwatch, and a pedometer borrowed from the local postmaster, Whimsy embarked upon what he cheerfully termed a constitutional with homicidal implications. Their first expedition took them from the Pier Pavilion to Trenwith House, following the precise route Mrs. Prynne claimed to have observed Mr. Vale traversing with his suspiciously wrapped burden at 25 minutes past 1 in the morning. The coastal path, when subjected to methodical measurement, proved rather more challenging than a casual observer might suppose. The distance covered a full mile and 2 furlongs, much of it along treacherous footing, where the cliff path narrowed to a ribbon between gorse bushes and a drop that suggested unpleasant consequences for the unwary. Bunter, timing their progress with scientific precision, recorded 22 minutes at a prudent pace for an unencumbered gentleman, 25 minutes when carrying the equivalent weight of a paraffin can and wood axe. Add the necessity of avoiding detection, Whimsy observed, pausing to examine the particularly treacherous section where the path descended toward Trenwith's grounds, plus the delicate business of manipulating window catches and arranging theatrical evidence. And one begins to question whether our Mr. Vale possessed sufficient time for such an ambitious enterprise. The return journey, undertaken with equal precision, confirmed their suspicions. A round trip, allowing for the commission of murder and the careful arrangement of supernatural misdirection, would have required no less than an hour and 10 minutes, a timeline that sat most uncomfortably with Mrs. Prynne's observation of Vale's return at nearly 3 o'clock. More damaging still to the case against Vale was Whimsy's investigation of the mysterious, endless music that had so impressed young Molly Perkins. Returning to Trenwith House, he positioned himself in the servants' hall, directly below the music room, while Bunter operated the modified gramophone according to its discovered capabilities. The experiment proved most illuminating. The Beethoven minuet played for its regulation 4 minutes and 20 seconds before winding down to silence. But then, with a barely audible click, a different sound commenced, a low, rhythmic whirring that emanated from behind. The music room's heavy paneling. It was not music in any conventional sense, but a continuous mechanical drone, punctuated by occasional faint thumps, as if heavy objects were being shifted within the walls themselves. That, Whimsy announced with considerable satisfaction, is what our observant housemaid actually heard. Not gramophone music at all, but the sound of Mr. Vale's generator at the pavilion, transmitted through the peculiar acoustical properties of fog and coastal topography. The whining belt we observed creates a pitch of approximately 340 cycles, precisely the frequency that would present itself to a provincial ear as continuous music, on a damp night. Bunter's examination of Mrs. Prynne's meticulous records supported this revelation with devastating precision. The generator had indeed suffered mechanical difficulties during the Charleston competition, but the timing proved fatal to Vale's supposed guilt. The machine had failed at precisely 1:47, according to her written log, not at the earlier time Vale had claimed, and certainly not during the period when he was allegedly committing murder at Trenwith House. The household's temporal arrangements provided their own revelations when subjected to systematic scrutiny. Whimsy discovered that someone had manipulated virtually every timepiece in Trenwith House with the methodical precision of a clockmaker gone mad. The long case clock in the entrance hall had been advanced by 9 minutes, while the library's mantel clock lagged by 3. Most significantly, the French ormolu timepiece in the music room had stopped at precisely 2:10 a detail that initially appeared to fix the time of Sir Julius's death, but, upon reflection, seemed rather too convenient for genuine accident. "Consider the pattern, Inspector," Whimsy observed, consulting his notes with scholarly attention. "Public clocks advanced, private clocks retarded, and the murder scene's timepiece stopped entirely. Someone has distributed temporal confusion throughout this house, like a conjurer scattering misdirection, creating the illusion of compressed time while actually requiring considerably longer for their preparations." The revelation that most thoroughly undermined Inspector Priest's confidence in Vale's guilt emerged through examination of the household's acoustic arrangements. Sir Julius had installed comprehensive soundproofing in the music room 3 years earlier, double-thickness walls filled with sawdust, and felt that would have prevented any sound from escaping to adjacent chambers. If the room was indeed soundproof, then Molly Perkins could not have heard any music emanating from within unless someone had deliberately arranged for sound to escape through the carefully opened casement window. The soundproofing, Mrs. Bletchley confirmed when pressed for architectural details, was Sir Julius's particular obsession. He could not tolerate household noises during his musical contemplations. Even the servants learned to remove their shoes when passing in the corridor outside. This technical revelation cast the entire acoustic evidence in a new light. The endless music had not originated in the music room at all, but had been a carefully orchestrated deception designed to create the illusion of continuous gramophone operation, while the actual murder was committed in silence. Someone with intimate knowledge of both the house's construction and the pavilion's mechanical difficulties had used these details to construct an elaborate alibi that pointed suspicion away from the household and toward the convenient figure of Eddie Vale. Bunter's methodical examination of physical evidence provided the final elements in this chronological puzzle. Traces of paraffin appeared throughout the house in locations unrelated to normal maintenance: the library door handle, the main staircase banister, even the telephone in the hall. Someone had moved through Trenwith House during the crucial hours with oil-stained hands, touching surfaces that would normally remain pristine while arranging the mechanical elements of their deception. Most intriguing of all was the telephone record Miss Tripp provided from the manual exchange. A call had been placed from Trenwith House at 1:52 inches the morning, a connection that lasted several seconds before being terminated without conversation. Either Sir Julius, still alive, had hesitated at making some crucial communication, or someone else in the house had been engaged in preparations that required telephonic coordination. The evidence assembles itself into a pattern of considerable sophistication, Whimsy concluded, as the afternoon light faded through the fog-shrouded windows. We are not dealing with a desperate musician driven to sudden violence, but with someone who planned this crime with the precision of a Swiss chronometer. The Axeman of New Orleans may have provided theatrical inspiration, but the murder of Sir Julius Rotherham bears the hallmarks of someone who knew both the victim's habits and the house's mechanical peculiarities with intimate precision. Inspector Priest, whose faith in obvious solutions had sustained considerable damage during this methodical examination, made one final attempt to preserve his case against Vale. The evidence still points to him: the typewriter, the paraffin, the missing axe. The evidence, Whimsy replied with gentle authority, points to someone who wished us to believe in Mr. Vale's guilt while they arranged considerably more sophisticated mischief. Our true culprit, Inspector, possesses not only the theatrical flair to invoke American phantoms, but the technical knowledge to manipulate time itself as an accomplice to murder. The chronological examination had accomplished its essential purpose. The neat case against Eddie Vale lay in ruins, replaced by the disturbing certainty that someone within Trenwith House itself had orchestrated Sir Julius's death with mechanical precision and psychological cunning that transcended simple opportunity or obvious motive. The revelation emerged, as such uncomfortable truths often do, through the patient examination of documents that their original authors had never intended for posthumous scrutiny. Wimsey's methodical search of Sir Julius's private papers, conducted with Bunter's assistance, and the sort of scholarly thoroughness that would have impressed the Bodleian's most meticulous librarians, uncovered a correspondence that cast the entire household of Trenwith House in an entirely different light, suggesting that the American axeman had been employed to mask secrets considerably more explosive than mere disagreements over musical taste. The first revelation concerned Mr. Grimsby's true relationship with his employer, a relationship that proved to be neither the comfortable arrangement of scholarly patronage that Mrs. Bletchley had described, nor the simple case of charitable employment that Inspector Preece had assumed. Hidden within Sir Julius's private files lay a complete dossier on what the insurance investigators had termed the Lycian Expedition fraud, a carefully orchestrated archaeological swindle that had cost Sir Julius nearly £8,000 and had transformed Grimsby from a promising classical scholar into something approaching a genteel confidence trickster. The Mediterranean expedition, Wimsey explained to Inspector Preece as they examined the damning correspondence, was not the scholarly failure we were led to believe, but a deliberately orchestrated fraud of considerable sophistication. Grimsby convinced Sir Julius that he was on the verge of discovering a lost Mithraic temple, complete with inscriptions that would revolutionize classical scholarship. The reality, according to Lloyd's of London, was rather more prosaic forged inscriptions, manufactured artifacts, and a systematic program of deception that extracted investment funds from wealthy patrons interested in classical antiquities. The physical evidence supported this revelation with devastating precision. Hidden in Grimsby's quarters, Bunter had discovered the tools of an entirely different trade than scholarly research. Lamp black, paraffin for deepening artificial weathering, thin paper for making epigraphic squeezes, and most damning of all, a portable engraving kit of the sort used by monument carvers. The same combination of paraffin and lamp black that had appeared on the music room's curtain cord, the same materials that had been used to create the acoustic deceptions of the murder night. Grimsby has been conducting what one might term a cottage industry in classical antiquities, Wimsey observed, examining a half-completed inscription that attempted to pass Republican Roman lettering off as authentic despite its tellingly Victorian characteristics. The squeezes and rubbings in Sir Julius's files represent not archaeological discoveries, but evidence of systematic forgery. Someone has been manufacturing Roman virtue for the edification of American collectors who apparently possess more money than epigraphic expertise. But the most startling revelation concerned the psychological dynamics that had governed life at Trenwith House for the past 5 years. Sir Julius had not employed Grimsby out of charitable impulse, but had kept him as a form of living trophy, a brilliant man reduced to servitude as proof of Sir Julius's own superior judgment. The arrangement had created a relationship of exquisite psychological torture, with Grimsby forced to maintain the facade of grateful dependency while knowing that his employer possessed evidence sufficient to send him to prison at any moment. The correspondence revealed the true nature of this domestic arrangement with clinical precision. Sir Julius had been methodically gathering evidence for a criminal prosecution that would have destroyed Grimsby utterly, while simultaneously employing him in a position that provided daily reminders of his professional disgrace and financial dependence. Letters to various legal authorities showed that Sir Julius had been preparing to press charges, not from any sudden discovery of fraud, but as the culmination of a 5-year campaign of systematic humiliation disguised as benevolent patronage. The relationship between them, Wimsey continued, his voice carrying a note of genuine distaste for Sir Julius's methods, was not employer and secretary, but hunter and quarry, engaged in a prolonged psychological siege. Sir Julius derived considerable satisfaction from maintaining Grimsby in a state of perpetual anxiety, never quite certain when the axe would fall, but always aware that it hung suspended above his neck by the thinnest of threads. More intriguing still was the discovery of Grimsby's own correspondence, which revealed a mind of considerable sophistication engaged in what could only be described as a long-term campaign of subtle revenge. Letters to academic contacts showed that he had been systematically undermining Sir Julius's reputation in scholarly circles, spreading carefully crafted rumors about his patron's intellectual pretensions and social climbing. More significantly, he had been maintaining communication with American collectors who had purchased forged antiquities, gradually building a case that would implicate Sir Julius as a knowing participant in the fraud rather than an innocent victim. "Grimsby has been playing a remarkably complex game," Wimsey observed, arranging the letters in chronological order to reveal their devastating pattern. While maintaining the appearance of grateful servitude, he has been constructing a counter-narrative that would destroy Sir Julius's reputation even more thoroughly than criminal prosecution would have destroyed his own. The question is whether he finally decided that murder offered a more expeditious solution than this war of mutual assured destruction. The technical evidence connecting Grimsby to the murder scene assembled itself with mechanical precision. The paraffin and lamp black used in his forgery work matched the substances found on the curtain cord and window catch. His intimate knowledge of the house's acoustic properties, gained through 5 years of residence, would have enabled him to create the sophisticated sound deceptions that had misled the household about the timing of events. Most significantly, his academic background in classical studies would have provided him with the psychological insight necessary to employ supernatural misdirection as a cover for entirely terrestrial motives. The financial arrangements provided the final piece in this puzzle of deception and revenge. Sir Julius's will, drawn up during the height of his confidence in Grimsby's gratitude, contained provisions that would have made his secretary a substantial beneficiary in the event of his death, provisions that Sir Julius had been planning to revoke as part of his prosecution of the archaeological fraud. Grimsby had been facing not only criminal charges and professional ruin, but the loss of his only prospect for financial security in his advancing years. "We are dealing with a mind of considerable sophistication," Wimsey concluded as the afternoon light faded through the windows of Trenwith House, "one that has spent 5 years planning not merely escape from an impossible situation, but a form of artistic revenge that would destroy his tormentor while establishing his own apparent innocence." The American Axeman provided the perfect theatrical cover for a crime rooted in classical scholarship, psychological manipulation, and the sort of long-term planning that would have impressed Machiavelli himself. The double life of Trenwith House stood fully revealed. Beneath the surface of scholarly respectability and domestic tranquility, a battle of extraordinary complexity had been waged between two intelligent men, each seeking to destroy the other through methods that transcended simple violence to achieve the level of psychological warfare. The murder of Sir Julius Rotherham had been not a crime of passion or desperation, but the final movement in a symphony of revenge that had been 5 years in the composing. The seemingly insignificant details that had littered the investigation like autumn leaves now reasserted themselves with the uncomfortable persistence of suppressed memories demanding acknowledgement. Wimsey, whose capacity for detecting significance in the trivial had elevated pedantry to an art form, began his methodical re-examination of evidence with the sort of scholarly precision that would have impressed the most meticulous of medieval scribes. What emerged from this patient archaeology of overlooked facts was a pattern of deception so sophisticated that it transformed every apparent clue into a carefully planted misdirection. The first revelation concerned the mysterious impression on the windowsill that had initially suggested feminine intrusion. Wimsey's re-examination, conducted with Bunter's assistance and a borrowed tape measure, revealed the mark to be precisely the arc left by the brass foot of the metronome, not the delicate heel of a lady's shoe, but the mechanical kiss of an instrument employed to hold the casement at its appointed angle. "Not a lady's heel at all, Bunter," Wimsey announced with evident satisfaction, "but the foot of a mechanical conscience." Someone positioned the metronome here to maintain the window's precise opening, enough to create a convincing draft when the door was opened, and to allow the calculated escape of sound that would support our phantom's acoustic alibi. The revelation eliminated the romantic notion of clandestine feminine involvement, while revealing the mathematical precision with which the crime scene had been arranged. More intriguing still was Bunter's discovery of the missing Georgian salver, a piece by Paul Storr, that had occupied the same position on the music room's side table for a decade, according to Mrs. Bletchley's meticulous records, but which had vanished entirely on the night of Sir Julius's murder. The salver, when located in the silver pantry where domestic efficiency had placed it for safekeeping, bore telltale scratches that corresponded exactly to the mounting points of a small electric torch. Someone required the salver's reflective surface for optical communication, Whimsy explained, examining the scratched Georgian silver with the attention of a numismatist. Properly polished silver provides an excellent mirror for directing concentrated light with mathematical precision. Our killer created a signaling system that could be observed from the village, establishing the illusion of communication with external confederates while conducting an entirely domestic crime. The sophistication of this deception revealed itself through systematic examination of the room's modified arrangements. The gramophone had been repositioned to occupy the salver's former location, while a concealed timer mechanism controlled both the musical performance and the optical signals according to a predetermined schedule. The entire system had been designed to create maximum impression of supernatural activity while providing the perpetrator with an unshakable alibi. The key evidence that demolished Inspector Priest's case against Vale emerged through chemical analysis of the music room key found in Sir Julius's pocket. The key bore traces of paraffin and lampblack, the same substances that appeared throughout the house on surfaces touched by oil-stained fingers during the crucial hours. More significantly, Mrs. Bletchley's testimony revealed that she had discovered the key separately and placed it in the dead man's pocket from misguided respect, meaning it had not been there when Sir Julius died. The key was planted posthumously, Whimsy observed, by someone whose hands bore the telltale traces of mechanical preparation. The same substances appear on the telephone, the banister, and various door handles, evidence of someone moving through the house during the night, arranging the elements of an elaborate deception while establishing their apparent presence elsewhere. The choice of Beethoven's Minuet in G, rather than the jazz demanded by the supposed Axeman, revealed the psychological complexity underlying the crime's mechanical precision. Whimsy's analysis of this selection exposed it as a form of intellectual mockery, Grimsby's final, sardonic tribute to his tormentor's musical conservatism, while simultaneously employing the threat of modern music as misdirection. The record represents psychological warfare of considerable sophistication, Whimsy explained. Sir Julius used musical taste as a weapon of social control. Grimsby's choice forces his victim to listen to approved classical music in death while using the spectre of jazz to create supernatural misdirection. It is both tribute and insult, conformity and rebellion, executed with the precision of a classical scholar who understands the symbolic weight of such choices. The telephone call at 1:52 inches the morning, initially dismissed as a failed connection, assumed crucial significance when viewed as part of Grimsby's temporal manipulation. The call provided an external timestamp that could verify the effectiveness of his systematic alteration of the household's clocks. Public timepieces advanced, private ones retarded, creating the illusion of compressed time while actually requiring considerably longer for the crime's elaborate preparation. The call was not intended for communication, Whimsy concluded, but for verification. Grimsby needed to confirm that his chronological deceptions were functioning as planned, that the various elements of his alibi would align with the precision of a Swiss chronometer. The brief connection served as a temporal checkpoint in a scheme that turned time itself into an accomplice to murder. The soundproofing that Sir Julius had installed for his musical contemplations became, in Grimsby's hands, the perfect cover for violent crime. The double-thickness walls filled with sawdust and felt that prevented household noises from disturbing classical appreciation also contained the sounds of struggle and death, allowing the murder to proceed in complete acoustic isolation, while mechanical deceptions provided misleading evidence of continuous activity. We are dealing with someone who has transformed the very domesticity of English country life into an instrument of perfect crime, Wimsey observed as the full scope of the deception became apparent. Every element of the household's routine, every mechanical convenience, every acoustic property has been employed in service of a revenge so sophisticated that it transcends simple murder to achieve the level of artistic statement. The American Axeman provided theatrical inspiration, but the execution bears the hallmarks of classical scholarship applied to criminal methodology with devastating effectiveness. The twist in the testimony had revealed not supernatural visitation, but something far more disturbing evidence of a mind that had spent years preparing a single night's work, turning the comfortable predictability of English domestic life into a maze of misdirection where every apparent clue led away from the truth, and every mechanical convenience served the cause of perfectly calculated murder. The fog that evening possessed the quality of a theatrical scrim, drifting in from the Atlantic with such dramatic timing that Wimsey remarked to Bunter it seemed almost too convenient for coincidence. By 9 o'clock, when Lord Peter announced his intention to conduct what he termed a small experiment in domestic acoustics, Trenwith House had acquired the sort of Gothic atmosphere that would have gratified the side most ambitious of penny novelists, though the proceedings Wimsey had in mind promised to illuminate rather more substantial mysteries than supernatural visitation. "Inspector," he observed, with the air of a man proposing an evening's entertainment rather than a criminal investigation, "I find myself curious about the precise acoustic and optical properties of this establishment under the conditions that obtained during Sir Julius's final performance. With your permission, I should like to stage a small recreation that might demonstrate certain mechanical principles that have thus far escaped our collective attention." Inspector Preece, whose faith in straightforward solutions had sustained considerable damage during the methodical demolition of his case against Eddie Vale, agreed with the weary resignation of a professional who had learned that Lord Peter's theatrical inclinations often produced results that escaped more pedestrian investigative methods. The household assembled in the drawing room with the nervous anticipation usually reserved for amateur dramatics, though the subject matter promised considerably more gravity than the typical village entertainment. Wimsey had spent the afternoon in preparations that struck the assembled company as either the height of scientific precision or elaborate madness. The music room had been restored to its exact configuration from the murder night, complete with the sophisticated modifications that had enabled remote operation of the gramophone. Beside the restored apparatus, arranged with mathematical precision, lay the various elements that had contributed to the acoustic deception: the metronome, the Georgian silver salver, the small electric torch, and a selection of gramophone records that included both the Beethoven minuet found at the crime scene and several examples of the jazz music that the supposed Axeman had demanded. "The key to understanding this crime," Wimsey announced to his assembled audience, which included Mrs. Bletchley maintaining her customary sentinel watch, Miss Lydia Rotherham pale but resolute in her determination to witness the truth, and Mr. Grimsby affecting an air of scholarly detachment while clutching a volume of Horace with what seemed excessive intensity, lies not in supernatural visitation or even conventional murder, but in the sophisticated manipulation of time, sound, and domestic routine to create an illusion so convincing that it misdirected suspicion away from the actual perpetrator while establishing an apparently unshakable alibi. The demonstration commenced with Wimsey's methodical recreation of the acoustic deception that had so thoroughly misled the initial investigation. From his position in the drawing room, directly below the music room, he activated the remote gramophone system through connections that ran along existing electrical conduits, invisible to casual observation, but accessible to someone with intimate knowledge of the building's infrastructure. The continuous music that so impressed young Molly Perkins, Wimsey explained as the modified system hummed to life above them, was not gramophone music at all, but a carefully orchestrated combination of mechanical sounds designed to create the impression of ongoing musical performance, while the actual murder was committed in acoustic isolation. The familiar strains of Beethoven's Minuet in G drifted down through the floorboards, muffled by the intervening structure but undeniably present. The piece played for its regulation 4 minutes and 20 seconds before winding down to whispers, then fading into complete silence. But then, from that silence, arose a new sound, a low, rhythmic whirring punctuated by distinct metallic thumping that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the house. "The generator at the pier pavilion," Whimsy observed with evident satisfaction, singing its mechanical lament across the fog. "The worn belt creates a pitch of approximately 340 cycles, precisely the frequency that would present itself to a provincial ear as continuous music on a damp night." Someone with intimate knowledge of both establishments had discovered that this acoustic phenomenon could provide the perfect cover for more sinister activities. The optical element of the deception revealed itself through Whimsy's manipulation of the silver salver and electric torch. Positioned at the precise angle maintained by the metronome's brass foot, the Georgian silver created a signaling system that sent regular flashes of light through the carefully opened casement window signals that could be observed from considerable distance and would suggest supernatural activity to anyone unfamiliar with the mechanical arrangement. "Someone in this house," Whimsy announced as reflected light danced across the walls in patterns that would have been visible from the village, created the impression of supernatural visitation through mechanical ingenuity and psychological misdirection of the highest order. The American Axeman provided theatrical inspiration, but the execution required intimate knowledge of this household's routines, acoustic properties, and mechanical conveniences. The most sophisticated aspect of the deception emerged through Whimsy's demonstration of the temporal manipulation that had enabled the crime's elaborate alibi. Using the household's various clocks, he showed how systematic adjustment of timepieces could create the illusion of compressed time, while actually providing the extended period necessary for the murder's meticulous preparation. Public clocks advanced, private clocks retarded, and the murder scene's timepiece stopped entirely at the precisely calculated moment, he explained, as the various chronometers chimed in calculated discord. Someone distributed temporal confusion throughout this house like a conjurer scattering misdirection, creating alibis that appeared unshakable while actually concealing movements of considerable complexity and duration. As the demonstration reached its crescendo, with mechanical sounds, flashing lights, and discordant chimes creating a symphony of deception, Whimsy observed with clinical interest the reactions of his audience. Mrs. Bletchley maintained her stoic composure, though her knuckles showed white where she gripped her chair. Miss Lydia watched with the fascination of someone seeing familiar surroundings transformed into something alien and threatening. Inspector Priest took careful notes, his professional skepticism gradually giving way to grudging admiration for the crime's technical sophistication. But it was Mr. Grimsby's reaction that proved most illuminating. The scholarly gentleman who had maintained perfect composure throughout previous interrogations now showed signs of strain that became more pronounced as each element of the deception revealed itself. A fine sheen of perspiration appeared on his brow despite the evening's chill. His grip on the Horace tightened until the leather binding creaked audibly. Most tellingly, his eyes darted repeatedly between the ceiling and Whimsy's face, as if recognizing the precise recreation of his own handiwork. "The real artistry," Whimsy continued, his voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute certainty, "lay not merely in creating these mechanical deceptions, but in understanding their psychological impact. Someone with considerable knowledge of classical scholarship employed the threat of American jazz as misdirection, while actually using the victim's own musical preferences as a form of intellectual mockery. The choice of Beethoven's Minuet, or rather, Petzold's composition suffering its customary misattribution, represented both tribute and insult, conformity and rebellion, executed with the precision of a mind that understood the symbolic weight of such choices. The demonstration concluded with Whimsy's revelation of the crime's the sophisticated element, the systematic manipulation of every aspect of domestic routine to create an instrument of perfect revenge. The soundproofing that Sir Julius had installed for musical contemplation had contained the sounds of violence, while mechanical deceptions provided misleading evidence of continuous activity. The household's electrical systems had been modified to enable remote operation of the gramophone. Even the coastal fog had been employed as an accomplice, carrying the generator's mechanical song across the village while concealing the optical signals that coordinated the deception's timing. "We are dealing with a mind of extraordinary sophistication," Whimsy concluded, as the mechanical symphony reached its final movement. "One that has spent considerable time, perhaps years, planning this single night's work. The crime required not only technical knowledge and psychological insight, but the sort of long-term preparation that transforms every element of domestic life into an instrument of calculated revenge. The American Axeman provided the theatrical mask, but the face beneath it belongs to someone who knew Sir Julius Rotherham's habits, this house's secrets, and the village's mechanical peculiarities, with the intimacy that comes only from prolonged and patient observation." The evening's performance had achieved its essential purpose. The comfortable assumptions about supernatural visitation lay in ruins, replaced by the disturbing certainty that someone within Trenwith House itself had orchestrated Sir Julius's death with mechanical precision and artistic flair that transcended simple violence to achieve the level of theatrical masterpiece. The fog pressed against the windows like a curious observer, and in the sudden silence that followed the demonstration's conclusion, the sound of someone's rapid, shallow breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the drawing room's charged atmosphere. The theatrical reveal had stripped away the supernatural misdirection to expose the human intelligence beneath. But the final act, the naming of names and the confrontation with guilt, remained for the morrow, when the fog would lift and the last secrets of Trenwith House would stand naked in the cold light of English justice. Morning arrived with the sort of brittle clarity that follows a night of fog and secrets, the sea outside Trenwith House murmuring its ancient indifference. Within the music room, the scene of so much carefully orchestrated confusion, Lord Peter Whimsy presided, not unlike a don at a particularly exacting viva. Inspector Preece, newly chastened, held his notebook ready. Mrs. Bletchley stood braced for any affront to English domesticity. Miss Lydia, pale, watched with the intensity of one awaiting a verdict on fate itself. Eddie Vale wore the look of a man whose name had been cleared by logic, if not by public opinion, and Mr. Grimsby, clutching his volume of Horace, seemed to shrink by the minute. "Forgive my pedantry," Whimsy began, monocle glinting, "but murder, like fugue, must be unravelled voice by voice. It is time to separate the melody from the misdirection." He gestured to the Ormolu clock. "The first deception is temporal. The hall clock was advanced by 9 minutes, the libraries retarded by 3, and this one," he tapped the French timepiece, "stopped at 2:10. This asynchrony allowed our murderer to manufacture a compressed timeline, to appear blameless while preparing the scene at leisure. The telephone call at 1:52 cut short was not a plea for help, but a time check, verifying both the pavilion's generator whine and the integrity of the electrical line. This was not panic, but choreography. Inspector Preece nodded, grimly conceding the point. "Next, the matter of sound," Whimsy continued. "Young Molly heard music well after 2. Not Beethoven, whose tenure on a wind-up gramophone is 4 minutes and 20 seconds, but the pavilion's generator, its failing belt, producing a continuous whine in the fog. The music room, soundproof to Sir Julius's exacting standards, could not have transmitted sound naturally. The slightly open window, fixed in place by the metronome's brass foot, mistaken for a lady's heel, allowed the external drone to seep in, simulating ongoing music. The curtains, oiled with paraffin and lamp black, were drawn to trap actual sound within while letting the impostor in. He moved to the side table, where the Georgian salver now lay. The salver vanished and returned, bearing scratches that matched the clamp of a small electric torch. Positioned with care, it became a signaling mirror flashing coded lights into the fog, visible from the village. Not for an accomplice, but to keep a private schedule, to synchronize every mechanical and human element of the performance. Whimsy picked up the curtain cord, displaying a faint, oily residue. This paraffin and lamp black is not found in the normal running of a household. It is the signature of forgery, not of gramophone maintenance or honest cleaning. The same mixture appeared on the music stand, the timepiece, the banister, and, most tellingly, on the spare music room key recovered from Mr. Grimsby's belongings by Bunter, and matching the warding exactly, Mrs. Bletchley, in her devotion, found the victim's own key and placed it on his person after the fact, an innocent act, but one that muddied the waters. Inspector Preece's face had gone pale as the logic took hold. And the Axeman's letter? Typed at the pavilion, yes, but not by Vale. The phrasing is classical melodrama, not the idiom of a jazz musician. Grimsby, with his teacher's pen, composed it quoting scripture badly, constructing neat parallelisms, and using his visit to the pavilion as pretext. Even the sacking used to wipe lampblack from his tools came from the pavilion, stenciled and purple, now found in his engraving. Kit. He turned to Grimsby, who seemed to wilt under the scrutiny. You were kept, Mr. Grimsby, not as a scholar but as an exhibit, a man ruined by his own hand, then preserved by Sir Julius as a specimen of English charity. With prosecution and disinheritance looming, you executed a plan not merely of escape, but of revenge. 5 years you spent mastering every quirk of this house, its clocks, its sounds, its servants' routines. You staged the Axeman's ghost, but the murder was all too material. Whimsy's tone softened, unexpectedly. You could have faced prison, Mr. Grimsby. That at least ends. But Sir Julius would never have let you finish. Your disgrace would have been perpetual, your talents wasted in humiliation. You chose to end the stalemate with artistry and cruelty both. There was a long, charged silence. Grimsby finally spoke, voice thin as tissue. And now, Whimsy bowed slightly. Now, Inspector Preece will conclude the business. I charge you, Mr. Grimsby, with the murder of Sir Julius Rotherham, planned with the precision of a scholar and masked with the bravura of a dramatist, but revealed at last by those very habits of mind. The drawing-room seemed suddenly lighter, as if the very walls had exhaled. Outside, the sea resumed its counting precise, inexorable, and untroubled by English crimes. The silence that followed Whimsy's methodical dissection stretched across the music room with the weight of absolute certainty, broken only by the distant murmur of waves against the cliff face and the almost inaudible tick of the metronome that someone had forgotten to silence. Mr. Grimsby remained motionless in his chair, the volume of Horace clutched in hands that had begun to tremble with the fine tremor of a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing with mathematical precision. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the hollow quality of someone testing each word for structural integrity before allowing it to escape. A most ingenious narrative, Lord Peter, he said, attempting to summon the scholarly detachment that had served him through 5 years of careful servitude. One might almost admire the artistry, were it not built upon such a foundation of circumstantial inference and domestic triviality. Whimsy regarded him with the sort of mild interest typically reserved for examining a particularly fine example of period furniture. On the contrary, Mr. Grimsby, the trivialities, as you term them, possess the uncomfortable habit of assembling themselves into patterns that resist artistic interpretation. The paraffin and lamp black, for instance, not mere domestic accident, but the signature of your particular trade in classical antiquities. The same mixture that Bunter discovered coating your engraving tools appears on the curtain cord, the window catch, and most damningly, on the spare music room key that Mrs. Bletchley, in her admirable but ill-timed devotion, placed in Sir Julius's pocket after discovering the body. The book slipped slightly in Grimsby's grasp, and he adjusted his hold with the careful precision of someone whose hands were no longer entirely reliable. Quote, the key was misplaced. Anyone might have handled it. Indeed, Whimsy replied with gentle persistence, but not everyone would have left the distinctive traces of lamp black and paraffin on the telephone receiver, the library door handle, and the main staircase banister, a trail that speaks of purposeful movement through this house during the crucial hours, not casual accident. The same substances, I might add, that you employed to create those remarkably grammatical Roman inscriptions for Sir Julius's collection forgeries, so superior to authentic examples that one almost regrets their fraudulent nature. Grimsby's scholarly composure began to fracture with the slow, inevitable precision of ice, yielding to spring warmth. His eyes, which had maintained their facade of intellectual detachment throughout the investigation, now darted between Whimsy's face and the various pieces of evidence that had been arrayed against him with such methodical thoroughness. The timing of events. Whimsy continued with the relentless courtesy of a don pursuing a particularly elusive point of classical grammar, reveals the true sophistication of your planning. 9 minutes added to the hall clock, 3 subtracted from the library's timepiece, and the French ormolu stopped at precisely 2:10, not mechanical failure, but temporal choreography designed to compress the apparent duration of events while actually providing the extended period necessary for your elaborate preparations. Inspector Preece, whose notebook had filled with the damning details of mechanical deception and psychological manipulation, cleared his throat with the authority of a man finally confident in his evidence. "Mr. Grimsby, I must place you under arrest for the willful murder of Sir Julius Rotherham. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be taken down and used in evidence against you." The formal words seemed to release something in Grimsby that had been held under tremendous pressure for 5 years. He rose from his chair with surprising grace, the volume of Horace falling forgotten to the Persian carpet, and for the first time since Whimsy had known him, the servile secretary vanished entirely to reveal the man who had once commanded archaeological expeditions and convinced wealthy patrons to invest in dreams of classical glory. 5 years, he said, his voice gaining strength with each word, while simultaneously carrying the bitter weight of accumulated resentment. 5 years of serving tea to a man who kept me as a curiosity, a living reminder of his own superior judgment. Do you know what it means, Lord Peter, to watch your life's work dismissed as fraud by someone whose greatest intellectual achievement was inheriting money from ancestors who possessed the wit he lacked? Miss Lydia Rotherham, who had maintained her composure throughout the investigation with admirable determination, stepped forward with the sort of quiet authority that suggested she would not be dismissed as a helpless female. "Uncle Julius was cruel, Mr. Grimsby, but he was not evil. You could have gone anywhere, started again. Instead, you chose murder." Grimsby's laugh carried no humor, only the hollow sound of a man who had discovered that perfect revenge provided less satisfaction than anticipated. "Leave? With what resources, Miss Rotherham? Your uncle ensured that I could find no other employment. His letters of reference were masterpieces of damning with faint praise. He had created the perfect prison, comfortable enough to prevent desperation, restrictive enough to prevent escape. I was his pet scholar, his tame forger, his living proof that English justice tempered with mercy could reform even the most sophisticated criminal." The Detimes Divinity's confession that followed emerged with the methodical precision of a scholar, presenting a carefully researched thesis. Grimsby described the months of preparation with something approaching his old academic enthusiasm, the patient study of the house's acoustic properties, the discovery that the pavilion generator's failing belt produced a continuous whine that fog would carry across the village, the gradual modification of electrical systems to enable remote operation of the gramophone. The American Axeman was inspiration, not imitation, he explained with bitter pride. A phantom who demanded musical tribute. What more perfect cover for eliminating a man whose musical pretensions had become the symbol of his cultural tyranny? Sir Julius believed that taste in music reflected moral character. I simply provided him the opportunity to demonstrate his principles under more challenging circumstances. Mrs. Bletchley, whose 30 years of managing household crises had not prepared her for witnessing the methodical confession of murder, spoke with the sort of practical authority that had sustained her through decades of domestic emergencies. "All those classical inscriptions you showed, Sir Julius, all those rubbings and photographs, they were never real, were they?" "Reality," Grimsby replied with the precision of a philosopher addressing a fundamental epistemological question, "is largely a matter of perspective, Mrs. Bletchley. My inscriptions were more grammatically correct than many authentic examples. I simply provided collectors with the classical world they wished to believe had existed. Sir Julius's crime was not in being deceived, but in using that deception to destroy me after he had profited from displaying my work as evidence of his own discriminating taste. Bunter, who had been conducting his characteristic methodical examination of the prisoner's effects, produced the engraving tools, the modified electrical connections, and the careful notes that documented every aspect of the crime's preparation. Each item told its own story of meticulous planning and psychological complexity that transcended simple revenge to achieve something approaching artistic statement. The locked room was elementary. Grimsby continued with the detached interest of a professor, explaining a particularly elegant solution to a complex problem. Sir Julius's own soundproofing provided perfect cover for violence, while the modified gramophone created the acoustic alibi necessary to establish my presence elsewhere. The temporal manipulations required more finesse. Each clock demanded individual attention to create the compressed timeline that would support the supernatural explanation. As Inspector Priest moved to escort him from the room, Grimsby drew himself up to his full height and addressed Whimsy with formal courtesy that suggested he recognized a worthy opponent in the game of intellectual detection. "You have been thorough, Lord Peter, admirably thorough. I confess I had not anticipated someone with your particular combination of pedantic precision and imaginative insight. The mechanical aspects were designed to baffle conventional investigation. I had not considered that someone might approach murder as though it were a problem in classical philology." The final revelation came as Grimsby paused at the threshold, his scholarly dignity intact, despite the handcuffs that Inspector Priest had deemed necessary. "The real tragedy is not that I killed Sir Julius, but that his death has deprived me of the only audience capable of appreciating the sophistication of my methods." He would have admired the classical precision of his own destruction, even as he condemned the hand that arranged it. As the door closed behind the prisoner and his escort, the music room seemed to exhale with relief, as though the house itself were finally free from the weight of secrets and deception that had transformed domestic tranquility into an instrument of calculated murder. The morning light, streaming through windows no longer arranged for optical deception, illuminated surfaces that bore no trace of the mechanical contrivances that had enabled perfect crime to masquerade as supernatural visitation. "Well," said Mrs. Bletchley at last, drawing herself to her full height with the sort of determined practicality that had sustained English households through centuries of domestic crises, "I shall have that music room scrubbed until it remembers only proper music." Whimsy, who had been examining the fallen volume of Horace with the attention of a bibliophile, looked up with the faint smile that suggested vast reservoirs of unexpressed observation. "The Axeman of New Orleans," he murmured, "has indeed crossed the Atlantic, though he arrived in rather different costume than advertised. Our phantom proved to be thoroughly English in his methods, if somewhat American in his theatrical sensibilities." The metronome continued its patient counting, and Whimsy reached across to silence it with 2 fingers. In the sudden quiet that followed, the house seemed at once emptier and cleaner, as though something stale had finally been opened to the sea air and carried away on the morning tide.